Welcome to Trial Site News podcast series. Today we are excited to have Craig Lipset with us on the show today. He is a recognized leader at the forefront of innovation in clinical research and medicine development. He is an advisor to technology and biopharmaceutical companies, leading universities and the venture community, bringing vision and driving action at the intersection of research, digital solutions, and patient engagement. Today, we will be discussing adapting trials during the pandemic and how studies will evolve post-COVID-19. So, Craig, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me today.
The pleasure is ours. Now, Craig, you have a lot of experience with clinical trials, technology, and process disruption. So how has COVID-19 been fundamentally a different impact on trial sponsors than other major crises, as an example, the 2008 economic crash?
Well, certainly an economic crash is a significant impact on many people's lives, but nothing of the impact to individuals' health and wellness like we're seeing today. Clinical trials are dependent on the ability for patients to participate. Without patient participation, we have nothing. And when patients with pre-existing conditions are at risk from leaving their homes, are at risk of heading into health centers, when our healthcare workforce need to redirect their energies to the front lines to be able to accommodate an unprecedented volume of patients with urgent needs, there's an additional disruption like we've never seen before. I think that most life sciences companies for years have been very thoughtful in considering various business continuity issues, concerned about cyber attacks, concerned about weather events. But I don't think any of us had planned for or anticipated the type of disruption we're seeing today.
No one could have foreseen this. So what are the most notable changes that you've noticed so far since COVID-19 hit?
Organizations are rushing to accommodate. They're rushing to accommodate and embrace tools that were available, but just simply often weren't being adopted. Home health tools, the ability to shift location for participation to the home, straight through to different types of monitoring strategies. I think we're all seeing this rush to accommodate and to leverage different existing digital tools in all of our lives, whether it's how we're participating in meetings to how we're doing our own shopping and engagement as patients. So it's not surprising to see much of the same rush to adopt in the clinical research setting.
Yes. Now, the randomized controlled trial is the gold standard of clinical research. And is this approach at odds with how we can capitalize on new technologies such as artificial intelligence, telehealth, and so on and so forth?
It's a great question. Tools like telehealth, artificial intelligence are great complements to randomized clinical trials, but we still need to understand exposure to new medicines with human beings and how our human systems will respond, whether in terms of efficacy and safety. I think there will be disruptions. We'll see regulatory innovations continue, such as the ability to have stepwise approvals of new medicines in narrow indications and understand additional exposure to wider populations with real-world evidence. And we'll see continued use of modeling and synthetic controls that can reduce the number of patients needed for studies. But we'll still need to understand how medications and humans interact, especially when they're investigational new medicines. And so randomized clinical trials will probably still be around for some time. Some of the design aspects around these trials will continue to evolve. Again, as we see pragmatic trials and other types of approaches that take great use of real-world data and real-world evidence, but we'll still need to understand and study these effects in patients.
Not to mention the approval process becoming more nimble. You can see it already now with the way we've been evolving with the COVID-19 response.
Well, you're right. I think we're certainly seeing the regulators responding as never before. We're seeing everybody acting in a far more nimble way than ever before. We see drug development organizations that are able to take a concept from an idea to a protocol to a first patient in record-breaking cycle times, right? Weeks instead of months.
Yes.
To be honest, I think what we're going to see next are development leaders, the leaders inside of these different pharma companies looking down at their organizations saying, aha, I knew it. I told you so. I knew you guys could move faster. And now you've shown me that you can. And so when we're on the other side of this pandemic, when we're on the other side of the curve, it's going to be interesting to see how much tolerance leaders of R&D organizations, leaders of big pharma companies have for anything slower than what we're seeing today, the ability to navigate internally through bureaucracy and get new studies started thoughtfully, but with incredible speed.
And I think you hit the nail on the head. The one of the issues, and there's a lot. The bureaucracy, the bureaucratic element, has definitely slowed down the process. And
Absolutely, across the whole ecosystem, as you mentioned, with the regulators, with the folks on the industry side, and certainly there are many with technology and innovative service approaches to how to run studies differently that have been ready and waiting. Many of the different tools that people are embracing didn't have to be discovered and invented. Telemedicine, home-based care, risk-based monitoring, all of these approaches were at our fingertips. It was really a question of adoption. And for that, we're really fortunate. We didn't have to wait for some technological breakthrough to come to the rescue and help make our trials able to continue in this environment. Really, it was a question of adapting existing studies, expanding our policies and procedures, and shifting our culture to move quickly and embrace.
so, what kind of technologies do you see emerging that, when brought together, can help trial sponsors produce more efficient, productive, and successful results?
We're certainly seeing today the rush towards decentralization, the ability to flex and accommodate participation in the home. But a key theme that underlies the ability to do this traces back to the endpoints that we're using for our studies. Our ability to embrace innovative, new, smarter digital endpoints is often going to become the rate limiter to our ability to embrace innovative and thoughtful new approaches to running the studies themselves. When we have studies that rely on legacy endpoints, like a 6-minute walk test, one that requires somebody to travel and appear in a clinic simply to watch them walk back and forth on a 20-meter track for 6 minutes, when we're not embracing digital approaches that can enable that data to be captured in smarter, more location flexible ways that are more resilient when disruptions like this happen. Those types of opportunities, digital endpoints and smarter endpoints, are a great opportunity, but also the rate limiter for us to be able to do so much more. But we can't quickly rush a new endpoint into a study when disaster strikes. Planning for a new endpoint had to happen probably 18 months, 24 months before that protocol was finalized. It has to be baked into the clinical development plans for the molecule, baked into the longer term budgeting. And so for us to really realize this benefit, we really have to look back and think more about the development process that we have for our molecules and bake this change in at the earliest stages.
Agreed. So, speaking of thoughtful and innovative new approaches, when you look at process changes and technology, can you describe for us how research might be organized and managed in the future?
When I think about the organization and management of trials in the future, it starts to look very different from the world as we see it today. The world as we see it today is a landscape of 1,000 islands, of little studies here and there that are each trying to pull patients into their data universe and engage them in different ways and have them share data in their little isolated studies and then bounce them back into their healthcare setting. But meanwhile, we're seeing some remarkable signals out there, signals like master protocols that can let us test multiple molecules in multiple different, what previously might have been different phase 2 or even phase 3 studies, but running under one master study. And we're seeing platform trials. We're seeing remarkable data-driven platforms that can enroll tens of thousands, or in the case of programs like the NIH's All of Us, enrolling over 1 million Americans to share their health data in a single research platform. And so when I start to think about what research studies might start to look like, it starts to be the convergence of these master protocols and these platforms. And we can start to envision how when patients are engaged and they're sharing their data in a platform-like way, we don't have to pull patients out of that environment to be in study A or study B. We could just run those new studies on the same platform. Keep the patients engaged where they were in a big observational setting, but give them the choice to randomize into different interventions over time, still on the same platform, sharing data the same way. And then when that randomized period of time ends, keep them on that platform and let them continue to share data as they were in a more observational way. But as we can start to envision ways to engage a million, millions, even more of Americans or patients around the world on these types of platforms, we can start to envision how studies don't have to be quite as isolated and disruptive as they once were.
Which also makes them more personal when you have that ability to reach out directly to your patients, even if they're not there. Which then brings me into the next question here, which is, we know rural healthcare can be difficult as patients don't have as many options for access for care. So how does something like COVID-19 affect rural locations? Now, as an example, I've seen the rise in telehealth, making it easier to reach folks who otherwise would have difficulty making it in to the hospital.
You know, this rise of telehealth is remarkable, and we see it whether it's for patients who are in rural settings, whether it's patients in urban underserved settings, whether it's patients who are trying to reach specialists today in distant areas. But in all of these cases, primary care and otherwise, telehealth is here, and I cannot see it going backwards. The patients, the consumers in healthcare have gotten a taste of what's possible. And in many cases, the providers themselves are seeing and realizing that even without the ability to touch a patient, there's a lot of good and a lot of support that can be made available. Now, the ability to use telehealth-like approaches in clinical trials are not necessarily something new. I had the opportunity to help design and execute the Pfizer remote trial over a decade ago, where we ran the study entirely from home. And even then, that wasn't the first instance of a study starting to use those types of telehealth and remote monitoring capabilities in a research setting. But like a lot of things, today is a period of adoption. And as we're seeing more adoption of these types of telemedicine-based approaches in our research studies, that's going to mean greater access for patients in rural settings who can't get to that big academic center. It's going to mean more access for diverse and representative patient populations who can't take the time off to travel to the big academic setting, and it's going to mean more access for patients overall. But to me, what's important is we shouldn't give up one option to open another door. We shouldn't look at remote and decentralized trials as the end of the brick and mortar investigator site. Patients deserve choice. We as consumers all deserve choice. I might want to do online shopping today to get my groceries delivered through Instacart, but that doesn't mean I never want to walk into a supermarket again and look at produce and pick things out myself. And so just as we're looking at telemedicine, remote types of opportunities for patients to participate, we should look at these and how they fit together with the opportunity for patients where they're able to still participate in a local investigator site, but look at these as tools to open more doors, not close.
So, falling on your expertise and experience in this area, how do you think then telehealth and digital healthcare may change after the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think in the beginning of this crisis, as it started to escalate, there was a lot of hope that this would be a 3-month exercise, a 3-month exercise of minimizing missed doses, a 3-month exercise of minimizing lost data. But I think that organizations are now coming to appreciate that this is not a 3-month exercise, and that what we were looking at as protocol deviations and SOP waivers, well, now we have to start to commit to the change. We can no longer look at these as deviations and waivers, which means these are temporary shifts and we're going to bounce back to the way we've done it before. We have to commit to the change and actually start to adapt our SOPs, our processes, our training, our development plans to accommodate better and smarter endpoints early in the process. We have to incorporate this commitment to change in order for us to sustain this beyond just a 3-month period of of study survival. Because as we see this being the new normal until there's at least a vaccine in widespread adoption, and we know that as drug developers, that's at least an 18-month plus exercise. Our studies cannot wait that long. We cannot wait to continue existing studies. We cannot wait to start new studies. If we have to keep waiting, we know what the implications will be. We will be looking as a society in 2 years' time at an unprecedented gap of new medicines reaching the market. There'll be this pause that trickles down into the future and delays for patients that none of us should be willing to tolerate. And so I think that as we think about trials on the other side of this curve, on the other side of this acute stage of the pandemic, we have to see this commitment to change and adoption.
I agree. So what areas then do you see growing quickly after COVID-19? How or where do you think people should be paying attention to?
I think we just have to look in our own dining rooms and kitchen tables and living rooms to see what this is going to look like. We see our kids learning at home. We see ourselves and our spouses taking meetings with consistency online. We hear the stories of friends who are seeing their doctors and providers through video visits. As consumers, we're not going back. Perhaps the hospitals would still want us to come back. Perhaps the schools certainly will see many students come back. Perhaps many business leaders may think that everyone has to return to the office, but many of us are not going to rush back into that environment and believe that that's the only way that we can work, learn, and seek care. And so I think that telehealth and these digital tools, well, they're not turning back. Now, we've had a lot of accommodation in policy to help drive that adoption. In particular, if we look at telemedicine in the United States, I think there were 3 things that drove a breakthrough in terms of the adoption. The first was reimbursement, and urgently making sure that providers were reimbursed at levels similar to in-person care. The second was around HIPAA and the expectations around the security of the approaches that we're using, and there were a lot of waivers dropped there. And the third was around state boundaries and state lines, and the concept that a physician in New Jersey couldn't possibly care for a patient in the state of New York without a separate license because somehow healthcare was different when you went across that bridge or tunnel. Now, not all of those policy changes will necessarily stay, but I think enough of them will, that adoption is not going backward. And so just like in healthcare, we're going to see this type of commitment to change in terms of the policies that we've adopted today and making sure that they as well don't go backward.
Right. Now, there are incredible things that technology and process updates can help trial sponsors accomplish. So as we move forward, or as we move toward a more optimized reality, yet remain pragmatic, what are reasonable targets for study sponsors today?
I think the 2 quickest ones to me are around safety and clinical monitoring, and how do we deploy our CRAs and other resources to support monitoring, as well as around home-based participation. These are 2 areas that were at everyone's fingertips in many ways. The concept that we don't have to do 100% SDV, and many of us knew that that was the case, but simply struggled in terms of driving that in a meaningful way in our organizations, or the ability for CRAs to perform so much of their critical work in a remote or centralized way without being able to get to the site. I think that these are areas that are quickly growing, they're accessible, they're practical. And then likewise around home-based participation, because quite honestly, I wouldn't know how you could start a new study with confidence in the year 2020 without having home-based options either built in first line for your study or having them baked in as a risk mitigation plan. Once upon a time, as recently as 2 months ago, everything I was saying was probably viewed by many as risk. But today, these are all being viewed as essential risk mitigation strategies.
So how do you then see clinical trials streamlining, which making sure patients on their medications still have access, and clinical trials integrity during COVID-19?
Well, I think you just hit on a few of them. To me, there are at least three key themes that organizations need to ensure to maintain continuity. The first, as you mentioned, is around drug access, the ability to get investigational product into the hands of patients, or in some cases, the infused therapy delivered successfully to that patient. Now, fortunately, one of the areas that the drug supply chain community, the investigational product supply chain community, started to adapt quickly around after the remote trial that we did at Pfizer was this concept of direct to patient supply chain and understanding and putting in place the processes to navigate supply chain, whether it's cold chain or otherwise, getting directly to patients at home. At times, I used to think over the last decade that these companies were getting way ahead of the curve. It didn't feel like there was that much demand for this approach, but I think many of them were. It was a good thing for all of us that they were getting ahead of the curve and figuring out the processes to be able to navigate that successfully. Now, sometimes that might mean an infusion in the home. And again, fortunately, there are existing landscapes of service providers that can help us with home healthcare for clinical trials, whether delivered by nurses, phlebotomists, physicians, or otherwise. And while I do worry about those resources getting exhausted, they are available and many study teams are relying on them. After drug access, that second area is around safety monitoring. Can we ensure and demonstrate confidence that we're able to successfully monitor the safety of the participants in our research studies? And again, as we mentioned earlier, some of that hinges on our ability to remotely monitor patients and enable remote and central monitoring that may be a little more data-driven than we had been using in the past. And then after ensuring drug supply to the patient and that we can monitor them for safety, the third area that's critical for us is our ability to capture endpoint data, whether that's efficacy or safety endpoints. Without our ability to capture endpoints, without our ability to avoid missing data, these studies risk becoming futile. Without all three of these, we risk seeing whether that's drug access and missed doses, the ability to monitor for safety, or the ability to capture endpoints. Without those three, we risk seeing studies become futile and have to terminate early.
Yes. Now, you touched on home care. So how do you see it changing even now during COVID-19 and possibly after?
There has been a universe of home health provider services. Often they're representing different geographies. Some might cover the U.S. and Western Europe. Another might cover Western and Eastern Europe. Another might reach very nicely into other regions of the world. And very often the sponsors have had to patch some of these different partners together. Sometimes they actually end up working well with one another in order to fill those different geographical gaps. I think right now we're seeing a rush to these partners, a rush from the industry to try and get their help. And I do worry about exhausting that supply. I think it'll be important for sponsors, though, to continue to build into their plans the ways in which home care are either frontline approaches for their studies and baking those options right in for patients, in particular, as we think about later this year, or at the very least, ensure that they have a strategy for using and shifting to home care in the event of a second peak, or in the event that patients are simply unable to leave their homes safely to attend visits in the clinic. I think that some of the evolutions in home care have started to incorporate better and smarter technology. Many of the home care providers have been at this for a while, but many of them have been based largely on contracted relationships with many different types of home care providers in various geographies. Some of these seem to be shifting more to gig economy like platforms and how to quickly mobilize and activate very diverse types of providers and covering very wide geographies. And so I'm excited to watch that technology disruption and evolution in that space.
So finally, how do you keep patient enrollment up during this pandemic?
I think this to me is all about communication at this stage. Sponsors, sites, and others are working aggressively to try to manage through this pandemic, to try to develop many of these countermeasures I was describing. But I also have an opportunity to participate in webinars and forum with different patient groups and advocacy groups and different patient communities. The consistent theme that I hear from patients is their anxiety during this time. Will I be able to continue to access medicine that I'm dependent on? Can I reach my providers? Can I be followed if I have a safety event? I think that we need to double down more than ever on our communication and thoughtful communication strategies to keep patients aware and informed during this tumultuous time, to make sure that as we're considering some of these different countermeasures, we're engaging with them, we're talking to them, we understand what may work or not work for them, but we're helping to address their concerns and anxieties. Now, there are other strategies we can start to deploy to try to reopen the doors of studies. Even when the clinic doors are still shut, we can still use other strategies to directly engage patients and to move them through the screening funnel so that we can develop repositories of engaged patients who can be screened online and data accessed so that as the clinic doors open, there are patients that are ready to join and participate. But again, even there, we need to communicate in straight and honest ways, because some of the questions about when the clinic doors will actually open may be unknowns to all of us. But it doesn't mean that we should necessarily sit by the wayside and wait for that to happen. I do worry about our investigator sites at this time. I do worry about the ability for independent sites to stay in business. Many outpatient centers have been furloughing employees, and that affects investigator sites as much as it does healthcare settings. Investigator sites rely on new studies to start. They rely on new patients getting enrolled to keep the lights on and to keep running. And both of those have been in jeopardy. We've seen groups like SCRS, the Society for Clinical Research sites, putting out calls for sponsors and CROs to release holdbacks and try to make more cash flow available to those sites. I'm hopeful that if we can continue to at least screen patients in an honest and communicative way, that at least we can continue to keep those sites engaged as well, and that when the doors are able to reopen, they can move quickly to try and get business flowing again.
Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to speak with us today, Craig. We really appreciate you.
It was a pleasure. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and your audience, and I'm just so grateful to be a part of this community that is going above and beyond in so many ways to keep existing new medicines moving and respond with such urgency to the call from society for new therapeutics and vaccines.
You can also check out Craig Lipset's website, coronatrials.org, which is a resource for new studies of COVID-19 therapeutics and vaccines. And you can check out Trial Site News at trialsitenews.com or Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube.